Okay, part two of the lecture on socially situated practices, and we're going to talk obviously a little bit more about the implications for design. The reason I put it in brackets has to do with a nice paper that Paul Dorish once wrote called Implications for Design, where he was actually quite critical about the idea that you could do ethnography of people's practices and then just from that write a list of design principles or design guidelines, just like that. This kind of straightforward analyzing the problem and then coming up with a solution is actually sort of going against the whole idea of socially situated practices and the sort of general philosophy behind it, which is not the kind of positivistic get clear on the problem and then find the optimal solution kind of thinking that engineers are maybe sometimes familiar with. So that's why it's sort of in brackets. But we're going to look at design anyway, because there are implications for design. If you think about socially situated practices more and you understand more of it, then this means you will be starting to design differently, and that's the implication. So just to give you one example, here on the left, you see the original way in which in Germany the train station started to become equipped with special places where you could smoke when when the cigarette was sort of banned at some point, right, a few years ago. On the right, you see a pole. It's not very clear to see, but that's a pole. And this pole is the design solution that the Netherlands came up with. And you see a clear difference in culture here. On the left in Germany, you could say, maybe a bit stereotypical, that Germans are more used to having clear and strict boundaries as to what is allowed and what is not allowed, and they stick to that. Whereas on the right, this pole had no boundary initially. It was just a pole. And you would be asked yourself as a Dutch person to just find a spot near the pole of which you, for yourself, could take responsibility in saying, I'm standing in the right place to smoke my cigarette. I'm standing near enough to the pole, right? And you could see all kinds of funny behavior as a result, with Dutch people sort of standing quite far from the pole, but making a sort of physical bodily posture like I belong to the space where the pole, so I'm still in the right area. I think at this moment you see exactly the same difference in culture between how we respond to coronavirus and the 1.5 meter requirement. It's exactly the same kind of stuff. By the way, the Dutch approach, which always focuses on taking your own individual responsibility and not having very strict lines and rules and so on, in the end didn't work for smoking. And maybe it also doesn't work for social distancing. So we now have these boxes as well, just like Germany has. Maybe a lesson in there. Talking more about coronavirus, this whole pandemic is, of course, one big experiment in looking at social practices and situated practices, right? So you see all kinds of examples of people trying to sort of live to these new rules, but then also around the rule, making forming new habits, forming new routines, forming new also norms and ways of doing stuff. And also you see sometimes how difficult it is to get away from the old traditional norms. So for example, the whole American staff of Donald Trump's standing on the right there, not keeping distance to one another because, well, I mean, keeping distance would be for the people, right? Not for these official guys, which makes no sense, right? So, and all this kind of herd behaviors of people walking, doing what other people do, and you see all the patterns there. So that's quite interesting indeed. And people have been also designers have been responding to that, and I will show you a short bit of these two videos. So these are called critical design. So what you can do as a designer, of course, is not only to make solutions that would really work within social practices, but the nice thing, yeah, one of the immediate things that you would do as a designer in response to certain situated practices is try to break through with a design, which is called social breaching. So what you do is you create something that evokes a response, and usually it's because in the design you make something explicit and visible that was up to that point more sort of subconscious and more implicit, right? So there is the distance of 1.5 meters, but what if you make this distance very visible? How will people respond to it? Now, what is actually happening when you see people responding to signs on the floor and responding to one another? You could say a socially situated practice that's out there in the public, like how we respond to this, how we do this social distancing. You could say this is actually in a way um, it's social and physical at the same time. So people do stuff. This leaves certain traces in the environment. They respond to certain constraints that are in the environment. But then over time, because all these people start doing stuff, you get a sort of you get the result of that becomes visible in the environment, and people start to respond to that again, right? Um, and in nature, this is called stigmergy. And stigmergy means that you see this in ants. Like, how does an ant trail evolve? An ant trail doesn't come about because there's one central ant saying to everybody, all the other ants where they should walk and so on. What happens is every ant responds to every other ant in a very simple way. They basically follow each other's chemical trails, but only if the chemical trail says there's that the ant has found food. So you follow ants who have already found food. Now, once you start doing that, this random behavior of ants, before you know it, becomes a neat trail from the nest to the food source. We do the same thing, right? We flock, we swarm, we're like sheep. Everybody just does what everybody does, and then you get patterns, right? And for designers of crowds, it makes much sense to think of crowds as flocking and swarming and creating these stigmergic structures, and then responding to the whole system and not to individual people alone. Now, if you look at how we try to control the crowd, so to speak, and make sure that everybody keeps distance, I've seen, and this is just anecdotal stuff that came online or that I saw myself when I was out on the street, is that you see different kinds of approaches. All the way on the left here, you see the most cognitive approach. It's just a very big sign, and there's a lot of visual eye-catching material around it to make sure that you actually see the sign in the first place. And then it says in print, watch out, keep 1.5 meter distance. Now, this sign doesn't work. I mean, you already see that it doesn't work, right, in the photo. And the reason it doesn't work is that people don't respond very well to this cognitive information. And that is because they have to translate the cognitive information into action. And the point is that the content of the information is not new to them. They already know that they should keep 1.5-meter distance, right? There's nobody that doesn't know this. So the information itself is not needed. What is needed is that you need to get the right incentive to act in the right way. And to act in the right way is very different from knowing how you should act. It has to do with all these kinds of local, social as well as physical circumstances. So you respond to the local situation that you're in, the moment to moment situation. That is what you respond to. And the cognitive information that you have in your head plays a little role in that. I mean, you could sort of consciously decide not to respond to something that you feel you need to do from the situation, but you decide not to do it. But that's much more difficult, and very often you forget about it. You just do what the situation affords. We're going to talk about the notion of affordances actually in the next lecture in quite some detail. But this one here below is a very different one. It's just making it physically impossible or much more difficult to be close to one another, right? So you could say if the top picture here is focused at your cognitive Cartesian mind, right, telling your conscious thought process that it should keep something in attention and act on it, then the bottom one is more talking directly to your physical body, right? It's just very difficult to sit here in the middle. You have to sit on the ground and it's cold and wet and you're lower than the other people. So you're not going to sit on the street, right? So you're going to sit either here or here. And this means you keep 1.5-meter distance. Quite a nice example. Now the ones here in the middle are a bit, they literally show you what is 1.5 meter. And that helps, right? That already helps because you can now use this measure as a comparison to where you are standing relative to other people next to it. And you can sort of judge, say, oh, I'm okay or I'm not okay. But of course, most of these kinds of pictures here are actually, most of it is still very cognitive. It's giving you a message that you already know. So it doesn't work all that well. On the other hand, the pictures here on the right, they are very strongly acting on your embodied, situated interaction, right? You see the dots, and all you have to do is stand on the dots. You don't have to question anything, so you're automatically guided. There are visually attractive spots that you very easily stand in. This text in here is not necessary at all. You can do it just like this in the bottom picture, just making circles. Maybe even circles with an inner side are even better than these red texts because we are not used to standing on a text, right? Because text, you need to read the text, so you're going to stand next to the text in order to read it. So that's even not really optimal. The optimal thing is here. It's just a white circle, very simple, and it's very clear what you need to do. Nobody has to explain. And especially if there's already two people standing in the circles, you walk here and you immediately know what to do. That is what I call an embodied design. Here is also an attempt in that, but you see at this bottom picture that it goes wrong. What the designer really intended for these stripes to mean is that these lines is that you would stand on the line because one line to the next line is 1.5 meter, I'm pretty sure, right? But that doesn't work because you want to stand here close to the counter, so you move forward and you're not going to stand all the way here at the counter, right? So that doesn't make sense. It's impossible to stand over there. So you're going to stand here in the middle, and that means that the next person is going to stand here in the middle. Now this may be 1.5 meter, but it also may be that this person is standing a bit to the back and the other person is standing a bit to the front, and then you're not 1.5 meters apart at all, right? So what you do here with these white nice spots, these guys really figured it out the best way, I think, is you do scaffolding. You make a little physical intervention in the world that enters into the action perception loop of people and into the social situation of people, and it mediates, it it catalyzes the process, and after that everything just goes by itself. It's very difficult to give a precise guideline on how to design this. This is also what Paul Dorish says when he says, like, you can't just, from observing the practice, you can't just get a design principle like that. This is difficult. You basically, you see the example and then you see that it works, but it's not very easy to tell you up front, like, oh, this is the aspects that all these designs have. I want to give you also two examples that are not from the coronavirus times. This is a very nice example that in which interactivity is used in socially situated practices. It's called Fireflies. And the idea here is that in the classroom, so in the normal physical classroom, children often get all kinds of yeah, reprimands or instructions by the teacher that don't have to do with the content, but with the atmosphere and the noise levels and so on in the group. So if people are talking too loud, or children are distracted, or they are doing other stuff that they shouldn't do, then the teacher has to say something, right? The teacher has to step in and intervene. And very often that can take up a lot of space and in the classroom itself, a teacher shouting over everybody like, can it be quiet here? So what Saskia designed, Saskia is from Eindhoven as well, she designed a distributed system of lights, and you can see one here. So it's actually very small and you can hardly see it. And this light has different codes, and you can discuss which codes to use. And this means that groups of children can work on their task, but when, for example, they become too loud, then the teacher can push a little button on an interface that she has. The interface is actually here now, but she can walk around the class, or he, and then use the buttons to, for example, change the light to the code that means this table group is making too much noise. Can it be a little bit more quiet, please? And then the children can see that and respond to it in a way that Saskia calls peripheral. So it's a peripheral thing. You can just continue to work, but in the corner of your eye, you see this lamp. Teachers don't have to shout through the whole classroom. Now, this is a way of sort of intervening in what I call the sort of the silent or implicit aspects of a situation, as we have been talking about it now, instead of making a design that really is in your face, in the middle of your attention, and that you have to respond to right here, right now as an individual. It's sort of a more a background kind of thing that that changes the atmosphere and the dynamics of the situation as a whole, right? Just like the white circles help people stand in the right places without really telling anybody very explicitly so. Another example that actually looks a lot like it, and it was developed independently, but in the end it is pretty much the same kind of design. This is also a system of lamps. This is a system that came from our own research. And I've been working with students for quite a long time, maybe 6 years in total, 4 or 6 years, in all kinds of iterations working on these lamps. And first it was just one big lamp, and then later on it became a system of lamps. And the whole idea of this is that this system is meant for people on the autism spectrum, adult persons with autism who live maybe semi-independently. They have some form of care, but they also take care of themselves. So they're not fully institutionalized or anything. They're just independent people with a job or whatever you. But they do have problems in daily life. And one of the problems can be that a person wants to do a lot of things on a day, a lot of small tasks, but it is difficult if you have autism. It's typically difficult to change from one activity to the other, not get stuck in one activity, or losing oversight of what all the things are that need to be done. And the idea here was, instead of making a task list, or instead of just using a calendar, or an agenda, or a smartphone application. We wanted, because that doesn't work. So the whole idea is that if you make a screen application, or even a whiteboard, the information is in one place, and the information tells you, oh, you should do the dishes now. But then you still would have to go from that place, or from your screen, from your intention on your screen, you still would have to go to the kitchen to do the dishes. And in that transition from where you are right now with your thoughts to where you want to be, to do the task, all kinds of things could still go wrong, right? Your attention could be grabbed by something else, or you might not even get to the point of actually going to the kitchen and start doing it, right? So we wanted something that is more attention grabbing and more action provoking. And so, actually, together with many autistic people that contributed to this participatory design research, we came up with the idea of light as an attention grabber, and we put wireless lamps in the house that people could themselves, they could decide, where do I want a lamp to grab my attention, and what do I want when do I want the lamp to be activated. And when the lamp would be activated, it would sort of tell you in a very implicit way, hey, look here. And when you would look there, you would actually see the laundry that needed to be done, or you would see the dishes that needed to be done. And so it would be the stuff in your living room itself, your own familiar stuff, telling you what you would need to do, rather than some abstract text in a calendar on a smartphone with all the other distractions that a smartphone can give you anyway, right? So that was the second example here that I put under the idea of socially situated practices, and in general, an attempt at an embodied design where you would be very much the information. So it also has this actually also is an example of distributed cognition, in the sense that the information is there where you need it, and the information is sort of it augments the whole space, right? So your whole living room becomes a knowledge base that tells you what is important and what is not important at this moment in time. Yeah. So to wrap up, um, socially situated practices, we started out looking at the fact that human activity is always socially situated. We are not detached individuals apart from the rest of the world, and the world is not just physical, but it's also social at the same time. And embodied interaction helps people make sense of each other and of the situation, and guides their activity. So by physically engaging with the space and with other people, we make sense of what is going on, so to speak. We don't do that purely sitting still in our heads. We do it in interaction. And the idea is that once you become sort of attuned or skilled into participating in a situation, right? So you know what to, you find out that you pretty much know what to do when, and in given a certain situation. That also at the same time means you have become a member of a community of practice. Now, importantly, physical things like artifacts, they mediate in these activities. So it's not just a social situation, it's not just me being with other people. If I sit in a restaurant and the plates are in a certain place and the forks, and the waiter comes with the food, and there's light and music and so on, it's all these physical things that have been designed or have evolved as part of social interactions, right, and culture. These physical things, they play a role in that too. They're part of that, right? So if you look around, you must realize that, at least in the Western world, almost everything around you is designed. And if it's designed or created by humans at least, it means it's part of social stuff, right? So we as humans were doing something, and then this physical stuff came out of that, right? Your desk, your floor, your shoes, your lamp, your the window, even the trees outside. They've been planted. Somebody has been thinking about where the tree should, how many trees should there be in this village or in this city, right? So everything is that is physical is also social and cultural at the same time. These two belong together. And then further on, you see that these artifacts they start to play an active role in keeping up the social activity, right? So if you have a table, then you can be together around the table, and that gives it a certain feeling and atmosphere to be together. If you can sit around a table, right? Tables are very important cultural things, not just to put stuff on. Now, finally, there's a great number of these physical things that are also representations of the practices that we are part of. So as soon as somebody started to draw a picture on the cave of the hunt and what was caught by the hunters, at that moment, the cave wall was no longer just a physical protection. It was also no longer just the boundary of the social gathering, so to speak, but it also became a picture of what was going on with the people living in that cave, right? But this picture was always there physically in the cave. When you came back from the hunt, you would see that picture, and you would imagine yourself like maybe your what you caught in the hunt was now there pictured by the painter on the wall. So you would be extra proud that you were on the wall and so on. So representations of the practice, they are things within the practice. They are not outside of the practice, right? So everything we write or draw or symbolize, every icon, every sign on the street, it's also a physical thing that is right there in the situation, influencing what we do. Now and then finally we talked a lot about some derived things from that, like social norms, micropolitics, how we present ourselves within those situations, something that Goffman speaks about a lot. The idea of social breaching, which designers can do quite nicely by creating critical designs that sort of question the practices that we're in, and stick merging. There is an error there, but I will leave it for you to find. Now, and then finally, next week, so we talked about external computation and representation a lot. We talked about socially situated practices quite elaborately now. Next week, we're actually going to go really to the body itself again and talk about sensory motor coupling or action perception couplings, which is the same. Well, it's not exactly the same thing, but I'm using these two interchangeably. Um, so you could say, well, yes, you talk about social and distributed and stuff in the world, but this was going to be a course about embodied interaction, right? So all this social and physical and spatial stuff, all fine, but what about the body? So we're gonna really talk about the body next week.